The day Alexander Whitmore finally noticed me was the day I stopped believing that staying unseen was the only way to protect myself. For years, I had convinced myself that a quiet life was a safe life, that if I worked hard, stayed respectful, and never asked for more than I had earned, people would eventually see my value. But I learned something over time that changed the way I looked at the world around me. Sometimes people do not overlook you because you are unimportant. Sometimes they overlook you because they have never taken the time to understand who you really are. My name is Olivia Bennett, and for most of my life, I was the person people underestimated before they ever heard my story. They noticed the way I looked before they noticed the kindness I carried. They remembered small mistakes before they remembered the effort behind everything I did. I worked as an assistant at one of the most prestigious properties in the city, the Whitmore Estate, a place where powerful people arrived every day believing the world was built for them. The estate looked like something from another time, with endless marble floors, towering ceilings, expensive artwork, and rooms filled with conversations about influence, success, and decisions that affected countless lives. I organized schedules, prepared documents, handled details most people never noticed, and quietly solved problems before anyone realized there had been problems at all. To the people who lived and worked there, I was simply someone who kept things running smoothly. I was useful, reliable, and almost invisible. For a while, I told myself that was enough. Alexander Whitmore was the complete opposite of invisible. Everyone knew his name. He was the leader of the Whitmore organization, a man whose reputation reached far beyond the walls of his estate. People described him as intelligent, disciplined, and impossible to surprise. When he entered a room, conversations shifted naturally because everyone understood the weight of his presence. He was surrounded by people who wanted his approval, his trust, and his attention. Yet after seeing him every day, I noticed something others rarely saw. The man who seemed to control everything around him was often the person who noticed the least about those standing closest to him. I never expected that to change because of a simple mistake. The first time Alexander truly looked at me was not because I had done something impressive or because I had found a way to stand out. It happened because I discovered something I was never supposed to find. I was organizing old records inside the estate library when I came across a document that did not belong with the others. It was hidden between several family files, placed in a way that suggested someone had wanted it forgotten. I almost returned it without opening it, because I had learned that some things inside the Whitmore estate were not meant for people like me to question. Then I saw the name written across the front. Bennett. My family name. I remember standing there, holding the document, and trying to understand how something connected to my ordinary life could exist inside a place built around one of the most powerful families in the city. My father had always been a quiet man. He lived a simple life, worked hard, and rarely spoke about the past. Whenever I asked about our family history, he would smile and tell me that some stories only made sense when the right time arrived. I never understood what he meant until that moment, when I opened the file and found a photograph that connected my family to people I had only ever seen in newspapers. My father was standing beside members of the Whitmore family, people whose names carried influence, people who belonged to a world I had never believed my family had touched. Before I could understand what I was looking at, I heard footsteps behind me. Alexander Whitmore stood at the entrance of the library, and although his expression remained calm, his attention immediately went to the photograph in my hands. For the first time since I had entered his world, the man who had walked past me countless times without knowing my name was looking directly at me, not because I had made a mistake, but because I was holding something he never expected anyone else to find. He asked where I had discovered it, and I quietly explained that it had been hidden inside the records. Alexander stepped closer, not with anger or suspicion, but with a level of curiosity I had never seen from him before. He looked at the photograph carefully and then looked back at me as if he was trying to understand how a piece of his family's forgotten history had appeared in my hands. When I asked why the image mattered, his answer stayed with me because it revealed that the past had not disappeared the way everyone believed it had. He told me that everyone thought that part of history was gone. Not hidden, not misplaced, gone. As I looked down at the photograph again, I began to question everything I thought I knew about my own family. I had spent my entire life believing my father's silence came from having nothing important to say, but standing inside the Whitmore library with a piece of a past I never knew existed, I realized there was another possibility. Maybe my father had kept that history hidden because it mattered, and maybe the man who controlled an entire empire had just discovered that the woman everyone overlooked was connected to a secret that could change everything he believed. Gone. Not forgotten. Not lost. Gone. I looked down at the photograph again and felt something change inside me. My entire life, I thought my family was ordinary. I thought my father's silence came from having nothing important to say. But standing there in the Whitmore library, holding a piece of a past I never knew existed, I realized something. Maybe my father had not hidden his story because it was insignificant. Maybe he had hidden it because it mattered. And the man who controlled an entire empire had just discovered that the woman everyone overlooked might be connected to a secret powerful enough to change everything. I thought finding that photograph would answer the questions I had carried for years. Instead, it created even more questions. The image sitting in my hands was proof that my father had a connection to a world he never talked about. A world I never knew existed. The next morning, I returned to the Whitmore estate feeling different. The building looked exactly the same. The polished floors, the quiet halls, and the expensive decorations had not changed. But I had changed. For the first time, I walked through those rooms knowing that I was not just someone who worked there. I was someone connected to a story hidden inside those walls. Alexander Whitmore asked me to meet him in the library before the rest of the staff arrived. It was the same room where I found the photograph. The same room where everything started. When I entered, I noticed the picture was placed carefully on the table beside several old documents. Alexander stood near the window, looking over the city. "Tell me everything you know about your father," he said. His voice was calm, but I could hear the seriousness behind his words. I sat down and thought about the man who raised me. My father was never someone who talked about success or influence. He cared about simple things. Keeping promises, treating people with respect, doing the right thing even when nobody noticed. He never spoke about this place, I answered. He never mentioned the Whitmore family. Alexander looked at the photograph again. "That is interesting. Because my family records show your father was once someone important to this estate." I felt a strange feeling in my chest. Important. That was not a word I ever connected with my family. My father was the person who fixed things around our home, cooked dinner after long days, and reminded me that kindness mattered more than appearances. But now I was learning there was another chapter of his life. A chapter he had chosen not to share. Alexander placed an old file on the table. "Your father worked with my grandfather many years ago." I opened the file carefully. Inside were documents with my father's signature. The handwriting was familiar. The name was familiar. But the meaning behind it was completely new. "Why would he leave?" I asked. Alexander did not answer immediately. He looked at the documents like he was searching for something that was missing. "That is what I want to understand." For the first time, I saw something different in him. Not just curiosity. There was uncertainty. Alexander Whitmore was a man who always seemed to know what to do next. But this was a part of history even he did not fully understand. Later that day, I continued working around the estate, but my mind stayed with the documents. I noticed small details I had ignored before. Old photographs on the walls. Names mentioned in conversations. Connections between people who had always seemed distant from my world. Everything felt different because I was finally seeing the bigger picture. That evening, Alexander found me organizing books in the library. "You do not seem surprised by any of this," he said. I looked at him. "I am surprised. I just do not think my father would want me to focus on what he had. I think he would want me to understand why he made his choices." Alexander studied me for a moment. Most people would be thinking about what they could gain from this information. I smiled slightly. Maybe that is why my father never told me. He knew I would care more about the reason than the reward. That answer seemed to affect him. It was a small moment, but I noticed it. The man who controlled so much of his world was beginning to understand something he had forgotten. Not everything valuable could be measured. Before I left the library, Alexander showed me one more document. It was an old agreement between the Whitmore family and someone from my father's side. But one section had been removed. Someone had intentionally changed the record. "Someone erased part of your family's history," Alexander said. I looked at the missing information. Why would anyone do that? He looked at me seriously. That is the question we need to answer. As I walked home that night, I thought about the photograph hidden inside the library. I thought about my father's silence. I thought about the way people had always judged me before knowing me. Maybe I had spent my whole life believing I was ordinary because that was what everyone expected me to believe. But now I wondered if my story had been hidden for a reason. And somewhere inside the Whitmore estate, the truth was waiting to be discovered. I used to believe that the truth was something people wanted to find. I was wrong. Sometimes the truth is the one thing people spend years trying to hide. After Alexander showed me the altered document, I could not stop thinking about the missing information. Someone had taken a part of my family history and removed it, as if my father's life was something that did not deserve to be remembered. The strangest part was not discovering that my father had a connection to the Whitmore family. The strangest part was realizing that Alexander Whitmore, a man who seemed to have every answer, was searching for the same truth I was. The next few days inside the estate felt different. I still performed my usual tasks, but the way people looked at me had started to change. Some employees whispered when they thought I could not hear them. Others suddenly became more polite. I noticed it immediately. It was not kindness. It was curiosity. They wanted to know why someone like me was suddenly spending time with Alexander. I had spent years being overlooked, and now I was being noticed for a reason I never expected. But attention was not what I wanted. I wanted answers. Alexander and I continued reviewing the old records in the library. Every document revealed another small piece of a story that had been forgotten. My father was not part of the Whitmore family by blood, but he had been trusted by Alexander's grandfather. He had helped organize important records and protect information that was meant to remain safe for future generations. Your father was someone my grandfather respected, Alexander said while reading through the documents. I looked at him. Then why does nobody remember him? Alexander became quiet. That silence told me more than any answer could. There was something he did not know. Something his own family had kept from him. Because someone wanted him forgotten, he finally said. Those words stayed with me. Forgotten. That was exactly how I had felt most of my life. Not because people knew me and rejected me, but because they never bothered to truly see me. I looked at Alexander and realized we were not as different as I thought. He was surrounded by people every day, but few people truly understood him. I was surrounded by people who barely noticed me. In different ways, we both knew what it felt like to be unseen. Later that afternoon, Alexander asked me to visit the old family archive room beneath the estate. It was not a secret place filled with dramatic discoveries. It was simply an old room with shelves of records, photographs, and documents collected over many years. But when I stepped inside, I felt something I could not explain. It felt like a place where forgotten stories were waiting for someone to listen. Alexander handed me a small box. This was found with your father's belongings, he said. I looked at him in surprise. Why did you not show me this before? Because I wanted to understand what it was first. Inside the box was a collection of letters. They were written by my father years before I was born. As I read the first few lines, my hands became still. My father had written about the Whitmore family, about promises he made, and about a responsibility he carried. But he also wrote about me. He wrote that he hoped I would grow up knowing that my value did not come from how people saw me. It came from who I chose to become. I had heard those words from him many times growing up, but seeing them written on paper felt different. It was like hearing his voice after years of silence. Alexander watched me carefully. Your father cared about you more than anything. I closed the letter and nodded. Yes, that was always the one thing I knew. For a moment, the powerful businessman disappeared. I saw a man trying to understand a story bigger than himself. Olivia, he said quietly, I think your father knew something about this family that even we did not know. I looked at the old letters again. A question was forming in my mind. If my father knew the truth, why did he choose to keep it hidden? And if someone removed his name from history, what were they afraid people would discover? That night, I returned home carrying copies of the documents and letters. For the first time, I did not feel like the girl nobody noticed. I felt like someone standing at the beginning of a journey that would reveal why my father disappeared from the story of the Whitmore family, and why Alexander Whitmore was starting to believe that the woman everyone ignored might hold the answer he had been searching for. I thought discovering my father's letters would finally bring me peace. Instead, it opened a door to questions I never knew I needed to ask. Every answer seemed to reveal another mystery hidden behind it. For years, I believed my father lived a simple life because he had nothing extraordinary to share. Now I was beginning to understand that maybe he lived quietly because he was protecting something important. The morning after finding the letters, I returned to the Whitmore estate with a different feeling. I was no longer walking through those halls as someone who simply worked there. I was walking through them as someone connected to a forgotten chapter of the family history. Alexander noticed the change immediately. He had always been observant, but now his attention felt different. It was not curiosity alone. It was respect. "You have been reading the letters again," he said as I entered the library. I looked at the old documents on the table. "I have been trying to understand why my father kept all of this from me." Alexander sat across from me. "Maybe he was not hiding it from you. Maybe he was waiting until you were ready." I looked at him, surprised by his words. The idea felt strange. My father had always believed in patience, but I never imagined patience could mean waiting years for a truth to appear. Together, we continued examining the documents. We found references to an old agreement between my father and Alexander's grandfather. It was not about money or ownership. It was about trust. My father had been responsible for preserving records that could protect the reputation of many people connected to the Whitmore family. But one important detail was missing. His name had been removed from the official documents. "Someone changed these records deliberately," Alexander said. His voice was calm, but his expression showed concern. "Why would someone erase a person who helped this family?" I asked. Alexander looked at the papers. "Because sometimes people remove the names of those who know too much." His answer made me think about my father's warnings. He always told me that honesty could make life more difficult, but it would allow a person to sleep peacefully at night. At the time, I thought those words were simply advice from a thoughtful father. Now I wondered if they came from experience. That afternoon, Alexander invited me to meet someone who had known my father. Her name was Margaret Collins, an older woman who had worked with the Whitmore family for many years. We met in a quiet sitting room inside the estate. Margaret looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "You have his eyes," she said softly. I smiled because it was the first time someone had connected me to my father in this place. Not through documents, not through history, through something personal. Margaret told us that my father was one of the few people who would challenge Alexander's grandfather when important decisions were being made. He was not powerful because of his position. He was respected because he had courage. "Your father believed that every person deserved to be treated with dignity," Margaret said. "He never cared about titles." I looked down at my hands. For years, I had felt embarrassed when people judged me before knowing me. I had spent so much time wishing I could be different. Thinner, more impressive, more accepted. But my father never taught me to chase approval. He taught me to become someone I could respect. When we left the room, Alexander walked beside me quietly. "Finally," he said, "your father understood something that many powerful people forget." I looked at him. "What?" He paused before answering. "That a person's value does not come from how others rank them." Those words surprised me because they sounded like something my father would say. For the first time, I saw Alexander differently. He was not just a man with influence and control. He was someone beginning to question the world he had built around himself. But our discovery was not finished. Before the day ended, Alexander received another document from the family archives. His expression changed as he read it. "Olivia," he said quietly, "your father did not leave this family by choice." My heart stopped for a moment. "What do you mean?" He looked at the paper again. "I mean someone made sure his story disappeared." I stared at the document, feeling the weight of those words. My father had spent his life protecting a truth. Now I needed to understand what that truth was, and why someone had been so determined to keep it hidden. I spent my entire life believing my father's biggest secret was that he had once been connected to a powerful family. I never imagined the truth was much deeper. The more I learned, the more I realized my father had not been running away from his past. He had been protecting something that mattered more than reputation, wealth, or influence. He had been protecting people. After Alexander told me that my father did not leave the Whitmore family by choice, I could not stop thinking about those words. Every memory I had of my father suddenly felt different. The quiet moments, the unanswered questions, the way he always reminded me to be careful about who I trusted. I thought those were simply lessons from a thoughtful man. Now I wondered if they were warnings from someone who knew exactly how complicated the world could be. The next morning, Alexander and I returned to the archive room. This time, he brought a collection of documents that had been stored away for years. He looked more serious than usual. "There is something you need to see," he said. I sat beside the old wooden table as he placed a folder in front of me. Inside was a series of letters written between my father and Alexander's grandfather. The first few pages were ordinary. They talked about business decisions, responsibilities, and the challenges of maintaining a family legacy. But then I found something that made me stop. My father's handwriting appeared on a page dated 25 years earlier. I cannot allow the truth to be changed simply because powerful people prefer a different story. I read the sentence several times. Those words sounded exactly like him. My father never cared about being important. He cared about being honest. Alexander watched my reaction carefully. That sounds like him, doesn't it? I nodded. Yes. He always believed doing the right thing mattered more than being recognized for it. Alexander looked away for a moment. I noticed something in his expression. Regret. My grandfather respected your father, he said. But not everyone in the family agreed with him. That sentence created a new question. Someone had not just hidden my father's name. Someone had disagreed with what he represented. Before I could ask more, Margaret Collins entered the room with another box of records. She looked at Alexander and then at me. I thought this day would come eventually, she said. Inside the box were photographs, handwritten notes, and a small journal belonging to my father. Seeing his handwriting again felt almost like hearing his voice. I opened the journal carefully. Most of it was filled with ordinary thoughts about work and family. But near the end, I found a section about me. My father wrote about the day I was born. He wrote about hoping I would grow up in a world where people looked beyond appearances. He wrote that he knew some people would judge me before they understood me, but he believed my kindness would always be stronger than their opinions. I had spent years believing the world had made me feel invisible because something was wrong with me. Reading those words changed something inside me. My father never saw me as someone who needed to become different. He saw me as someone who already had value. Alexander was quiet as he watched me close the journal. Your father was a remarkable man, he said. I smiled softly. He was just my dad. Alexander looked at me. Sometimes the people who seem ordinary are the ones who leave the greatest impact. That sentence stayed with me because I knew he was not only talking about my father. He was also beginning to see me differently. Later that day, I walked through the estate and noticed how much had changed. The same people who once ignored me now looked at me with questions in their eyes. But strangely, I no longer needed their approval. Finding the truth about my father had helped me find something about myself. I was not valuable because of a hidden connection to the Whitmore family. I was valuable because of who I had always been. That evening, Alexander called me back to the library. He had discovered one final document hidden among the old records. When I entered the room, I immediately noticed his expression. What did you find? I asked. He placed the document on the table. A record that explains why your father disappeared from Whitmore history. I looked at the paper, feeling my heartbeat grow faster. After years of wondering who my father truly was, I was finally close to the answer. But I did not know that the truth waiting inside that document would change how I saw the entire Whitmore legacy. I stared at the document on the library table, afraid that opening it would change everything I believed about my father. For years, I had carried a simple image of him in my mind. He was the kind man who came home after a long day, the father who taught me to treat everyone with respect, and the person who always reminded me that honesty mattered more than recognition. But now I was learning that his life had been connected to secrets, decisions, and responsibilities I never knew existed. Alexander stood across from me, waiting patiently. For once, the most powerful man in the room was not trying to control the moment. He was allowing me to discover the truth at my own pace. I opened the document slowly. The first pages contained information about my father's role within the Whitmore family years ago. He had not been an employee. He had been a trusted advisor who helped preserve important records and protect the values that the family claimed to represent. But the final pages revealed something unexpected. My father had discovered that certain decisions were being made that went against the principles he believed in. Instead of staying silent, he chose to step away. He chose integrity over comfort. I read the words carefully, feeling a mixture of sadness and pride. My father had walked away from a world of influence because he refused to compromise what he believed was right. He left because he knew the truth would eventually matter. I whispered. Alexander looked at the document. I think you are right. I looked at him. You did not know this before. He shook his head slowly. No, my family only kept the version of the story that was convenient for them. That answer surprised me. Alexander Whitmore had spent his life surrounded by information, yet even he had been protected from the full truth. The discovery was not only changing how I saw my father. It was changing how I saw Alexander. He was not the person who had created the secrets. He was someone who had inherited them. The next few hours were spent reviewing every piece of information we could find. The more we discovered, the clearer the picture became. My father had not disappeared because he was insignificant. He had disappeared because he refused to let others rewrite his principles. Margaret joined us again that afternoon. She placed another small envelope on the table. "Your father asked me to keep this safe," she said. I looked at her in surprise. "Why did he trust you?" She smiled gently. "Because he knew I believed the same things he did." Inside the envelope was a letter addressed to me. Not to Alexander. Not to the Whitmore family. To me. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. My father's words filled the page. He wrote that he hoped I would never measure myself by the opinions of others. He wrote that the world often notices appearances before character, but that true value is revealed through choices. He knew there would be moments when people underestimated me. He knew there would be moments when I questioned myself. But he wanted me to remember that being different was never something to apologize for. I finished reading the letter in silence. For years, I had wondered why people were so quick to judge me. Why they noticed my appearance before my heart. Why they decided who I was before hearing my story. But my father had always known the truth. The opinions of others could never define me. When I looked up, Alexander was watching me with a thoughtful expression. "Your father gave you something more valuable than any position or title," he said. "He gave you a reason to believe in yourself." I smiled softly. That was always who he was. For the first time, I saw a change in Alexander. He was not looking at me because of my connection to his family. He was looking at me because he respected the person I had become. Later that evening, we walked through the quiet halls of the estate. The same place where I once felt invisible now felt completely different. I no longer saw myself as someone who did not belong. I understood that my place had never depended on how others viewed me. It depended on knowing my own worth. But just as I thought we had uncovered the full story, Alexander stopped near the entrance of the library. He looked at me seriously. "Olivia, there is one thing we still do not understand." I turned toward him. "What is that?" He looked back at the old records. "Who wanted your father's name removed from history, and why?" I felt the weight of those words. The truth about my father had finally been revealed. But the reason someone tried to erase that truth was still waiting in the shadows. I used to think the hardest part of discovering the truth was finding the answers. I was wrong. The hardest part was accepting that some answers change the way you see everything you once believed. After learning why my father walked away from the Whitmore family, I thought I finally understood his story. But one question remained unanswered. Who had removed his name from history, and why? Alexander and I spent the next morning reviewing every record connected to my father's time with the Whitmore family. The more we searched, the more we noticed a pattern. It was not just one document that had been changed. Several records had been quietly altered over the years. Names were removed. Details were shortened. Important moments were rewritten until my father's contribution almost disappeared completely. Someone wanted people to forget what he did, I said. Alexander stood beside the archive shelves, looking through the old files. Or they wanted people to forget what he knew. His words made the room feel quieter. I thought about my father's life. He never spoke badly about anyone. He never encouraged me to hold grudges. Even when he was hurt, he chose peace. That was the kind of person he was. But now I wondered how difficult it must have been for him to walk away from something he had spent years building. Later that afternoon, Alexander asked me to join him in another part of the estate. It was a smaller room filled with personal belongings from previous generations of the Whitmore family. There were old photographs, handwritten notes, and memories that had been carefully preserved. Alexander stopped in front of one photograph. It showed his grandfather standing beside several people who had helped build the family organization. My father was there. He was younger, but I recognized him immediately. He looked confident. He looked like someone who believed he belonged. "I never saw this picture before," Alexander said quietly. I looked at him. "How is that possible?" He answered honestly. "Because someone decided which parts of history my family was allowed to see." For the first time, I saw frustration on his face. Not anger. Something deeper. Disappointment. Alexander had inherited a powerful name, but he was discovering that even powerful families could be built on incomplete truths. "You know what is strange?" I said. He looked at me. My whole life, people looked at me and decided they already knew who I was. They saw my appearance and made assumptions. But now I am standing here realizing that your family did the same thing to my father. They judged his importance without understanding his choices. Alexander became quiet. I knew my words reached him because they were not just about my father anymore. They were about every person who had been overlooked. You are right, he finally said. I think I spent years believing I understood people because I knew their positions. But I was only seeing the surface. That was the moment I realized something had changed. Alexander was no longer searching for information because it affected his family's reputation. He was searching because he wanted to understand the truth. We continued looking through the room and discovered a small notebook hidden inside an old wooden drawer. It belonged to my father. Inside were notes about meetings, decisions, and conversations from years ago. But one page caught my attention. My father had written about Alexander's grandfather. He wrote that the man had good intentions, but had allowed fear and pride to influence important choices. My father believed every person had the ability to change if they were willing to admit when they were wrong. I looked at Alexander. My father believed people could become better. Alexander read the words carefully. Even when they made mistakes? I nodded. Especially then. He smiled slightly, almost like he was hearing something he needed to hear. That evening, Alexander made a decision. He would restore my father's name in the official records and correct the information that had been changed over the years. I expected him to do it because of responsibility. But when he explained his reason, I understood something deeper. Your father deserved the truth, he said. Not because he was connected to my family. Because he was a good man. Those words meant more than any title or recognition could have. For the first time, my father's story was not being restored because of power. It was being restored because it was right. As I left the estate that night, I looked back at the building where I had once felt invisible. Everything looked the same, but I did not feel the same. I had spent years believing I was the person nobody noticed. Now I understood something my father had always known. Being unseen does not mean you have no value. Sometimes the people the world overlooks are the ones carrying the truths everyone needs to discover. I thought restoring my father's name would be the end of the journey. I thought once the truth was finally recognized, the questions would disappear and everything would return to normal. But I learned something important that day. Truth does not erase the past. It teaches people how to face it. After Alexander decided to correct the records, the atmosphere inside the Whitmore estate slowly began to change. The documents were updated, my father's contributions were acknowledged, and the story that had been hidden for years was finally being told honestly. But the most surprising change was not in the records. It was in the people. Those who once looked at me as someone ordinary started seeing me differently. Some approached me with questions. Some apologized for the way they had treated me before. But I realized something. Their opinions were no longer the thing I was searching for. I had spent too much of my life waiting for people to recognize my value. My father's letter had taught me that my worth was never something others had the power to give me. It was something I carried with me all along. Alexander noticed that I was quieter than usual as we walked through the estate gardens one afternoon. The city was calm, and for the first time since discovering the hidden documents, there was a sense of peace. You seem different, he said. I smiled slightly. I think I finally understand something my father tried to teach me for years. Alexander looked at me. What is that? I looked toward the gardens. That being accepted by others is not the same as accepting yourself. He nodded slowly. I could tell those words meant something to him. Alexander had spent most of his life surrounded by people who respected his position. But respect based on power was not the same as respect based on who someone truly was. Over the following days, I saw another side of him. He started asking questions instead of giving orders. He listened more carefully to the people around him. He looked at old decisions with a willingness to understand instead of simply defend them. The man everyone viewed as impossible to change was beginning to change because he finally allowed himself to see beyond appearances. One evening, Alexander invited me to the library. The room where this entire journey had started felt different now. It was no longer a place filled with hidden secrets. It had become a place where the truth was finally allowed to exist. He placed a new file on the table. This belongs to your family, he said. Inside were copies of the restored records and a written acknowledgement from the Whitmore organization recognizing my father's role. I looked at the pages quietly. It was something my father deserved, but something he never asked for. He would not have wanted attention, I said. Alexander smiled softly. I know. That is exactly why he deserved respect. I looked at him and realized how much he had changed. Months earlier, he would have focused only on protecting the Whitmore image. Now he cared about doing what was right, even when it meant admitting that the past had not been perfect. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. Alexander looked at the documents for a moment before answering. "Because I spent my entire life believing power meant protecting what you built. Your father showed me that sometimes power means having the courage to correct what was wrong." His answer stayed with me. The man who once seemed untouchable was learning the same lesson my father had always lived by. A person's true strength was not measured by how many people followed them. It was measured by how they treated people when they had nothing to gain. That night, I returned home with a peaceful feeling I had not known for years. The questions about my father were finally becoming answers. But there was still one thing I needed to understand. Why had my father trusted Alexander's family enough to stay silent for so long? And why had Alexander's grandfather allowed the truth to disappear? The final pieces of the story were still waiting to be uncovered. But for the first time, I was no longer afraid of what I would find. I had spent my life believing my story was small, because that was what people saw when they looked at me. Now I knew better. A person's story is not defined by how the world sees them. It is defined by the courage they carry when the world finally learns the truth. I used to believe the most important moment of my life would be the day I discovered the truth about my father. But now I understand something different. The truth was never just about what happened in the past. It was about what we chose to do after learning it. The final answers were waiting inside the Whitmore archives, but they were not hidden in some dramatic secret. They were hidden in the choices people made and the reasons behind them. Alexander and I returned to the library one final time. The same room where I found the first photograph. The same room where my entire understanding of my family began to change. On the table was the last collection of documents from the old records. Alexander looked through them carefully before speaking. "I found something about my grandfather," he said. I sat down and waited. Inside the file was a personal letter written years ago. It explained that Alexander's grandfather had not removed my father from history because he believed my father was unimportant. The truth was much more complicated. My father had discovered that certain decisions within the organization were creating problems for people who depended on them. He believed the family needed to change direction. Instead of accepting that advice, some people chose to protect tradition and reputation. My father decided to leave rather than become part of something he did not believe in. But before he left, Alexander's grandfather asked him to protect the records and wait for a future generation to understand the truth. I read the letter slowly. My father had not been forgotten because he lacked importance. He had been hidden because his values challenged people who were not ready to listen. I looked at Alexander. "Your grandfather respected him." Alexander nodded. "Yes, I think he did. He just did not have the courage to make the right choice at the time." That answer showed me how much Alexander had changed. The man sitting beside me was not defending his family name anymore. He was accepting the complicated parts of it. He understood that honoring a legacy did not mean pretending mistakes never happened. It meant learning from them. A few weeks later, the Whitmore organization officially restored my father's records. His story was no longer a forgotten detail. It became a reminder of the values that should guide the future. I attended the announcement quietly. I did not stand there because I wanted attention. I stood there because my father's truth deserved to be known. After everything was finished, Alexander and I walked through the garden behind the estate. The same garden where we had once discussed questions we did not have answers for. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you never found that photograph?" Alexander asked. I smiled. "All the time." "And what do you think?" I looked at the flowers around us and thought about the journey that brought me there. "I think some stories find us when we are ready to understand them." Alexander smiled. "Your father would have liked that answer." I looked at him. "I think he would have liked the person you became too." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your father taught me something I should have learned years ago. A person's value is not determined by where they stand in society. It is determined by what they stand for." Those words meant everything because they showed me that the journey had changed both of us. I had learned that being overlooked did not mean being insignificant. Alexander had learned that power without understanding was incomplete. The world had once seen me as just an ordinary woman, a person who could be ignored, a person whose story did not seem important. But my father knew something the world did not. He knew that a quiet person could carry incredible strength. He knew that kindness could survive in places where people forgot its value. and he knew that the truth always had a way of returning. Years later, when people talked about the changes inside the Whitmore organization, they often mentioned new decisions and new leadership. But I remembered something much simpler. I remembered an old photograph, a hidden letter, and a journey that taught me who I truly was. I remembered the man who discovered my story and learned to see beyond appearances. And I remembered the lesson my father left behind. The world may decide what it notices, but only you can decide your worth. Sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the person carrying the truth that changes everything.